I have always loved the Midwest. I grew up here. It's my home. I love the cornfields and sunsets, the creeks and wetlands, and the small patches of preserved prairie where the grasshoppers spit their tobacco juice on the hands of too inquisitive visitors. But I loved it in pieces. I was too little to take it all in, too little to comprehend the natural events and historical figures which had helped shape the physical and spiritual landscape. Mazzuchelli has always been part of the landscape of my life, quite literally. Every summer afternoon that I spent playing in my grandparents' yard with my siblings and cousins was also spent in easy sight of the Sinsinawa Mound, a gentle bulk of earth and trees resting on the southern horizon. This mound was one of 4 in southwest Wisconsin: Platteville, Belmont, Blue, and Sinsinawa, features of the driftless region which the glaciers bypassed on their leisurely journey through the Midwest. It was here that Father Mazzuchelli had founded a community of Dominican religious sisters. As a child, I had some vague notion of his name being tied to that mound, but for the most part, Mazzuchelli was simply a name I associated with the Midwest, a name like Mississippi. It even had the same number of letters. My early knowledge of Mazzuchelli was cursory. I knew him only as the founder of my home parish, St. Mary's in Iowa City, Iowa. I saw him only as a portrait of an amiable-looking young man displayed in the church hall. But as with my love of the landscape, gradually I came to know more about him and expand my horizons. Carlo Gaetano Samuel Mazzuchelli was born in Milan, Italy in 1806. He entered the Dominican order in 1823 at the age of 17 and was ordained a priest in 1830. Upon entering the Dominicans, Friar Samuel took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Seeing this young and willing servant, God seized the opportunity and made him what every saint aspires to be. God made Samuel natural. Nature is given wholly over to its Maker, and as such it grows in accordance to his word and will. Likewise, Mazzuchelli did what few others have succeeded in doing. He turned himself wholly over to God, and so became a force like that of nature, tireless and unceasing. Traveling to America, Samuel began the daunting task of serving the varied peoples of the Midwest, starting in Michigan and then traveling farther west to Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Up and down the Mississippi he went, ministering to the people. At one time, he was the only priest serving an area as large as Italy. The strong roots of Catholicism in this area were not accomplished by chance. They were planted by Father Mazzuchelli. Just as the 4 mounds provided clearly visible landmarks in the physical landscape, the 4 pillars of Father Samuel's Dominican spirituality guided him in his mission. These were the tools he used to cultivate the spiritual, civic, and cultural life of the Midwest people. First pillar, prayer. How beautiful, how sublime were the thoughts that silently came to the soul of one who, lying in the vast meadow, was led by the countless glowing stars to contemplate the glory of the blessed. Father Mazzuchelli from his memoirs. Prayer flowed through Mazzuchelli as constantly as the ever-present winds blowing on the prairie. From the daily rhythm of the divine office to the countless prayers he offered in the solitary hours of his constant commutes between towns and settlements. During the long and arduous journeys of the early and mid-1800s, there was little else to do, but the beauty of the untamed landscape in which he found himself led the young priest very naturally to prayer. I know from my own experience that traveling alone affords ample time to pray. I too have felt moved to prayer at the natural beauty of this world, and felt the true refrain of, "Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art." In his lengthy trips across this wild and lonely landscape, hills, woods, and endless prairie, he must have prayed countless rosaries, sung many spontaneous hymns of praise. And yet, prayer alone was not enough for this man. In addition to prayer, he engaged in fasting and mortifications. One example of this was the wearing of an iron penance chain, which was not discovered until after his death. He had worn this chain to increase his suffering, which he united to the sufferings of Christ. Second pillar, study. The reader should not imagine that the intelligence of an American Indian is less able than his own to comprehend the truths of our holy religion. Father Mazzuchelli from his memoirs. Dominicans are devoted to study, to learning, and therefore to teaching. Mazzuchelli established multiple Catholic schools, teaching and preaching wherever he went. As the river irrigated the land it flowed through, Mazzuchelli brought culture and dignity to the hard-working European immigrants of the Midwest. In his ministry among the Native Americans, he treated them with respect and held their spiritual practices in a higher regard than did many missionaries of the day. He encouraged them in their education, but far from stamping out their history and language, as so many Indian schools did at the time, he insisted that they were to be taught first and foremost in their own language and by their own people. The first book to be printed in the territory which would become the state of Wisconsin was a Catholic missal in the Winnebago language, which Father Mazzuchelli commissioned. Likewise, he was a bit of a revolutionary in his approach to women. Not only did he found an order of women religious to help minister to the people, but he gave them a measure of authority that many women of the day did not have. He founded a girls' academy and encouraged all subjects, particularly the sciences. Third pillar, community. Few people can realize the emotion of two priests who, after months of solitude, have the consolation of meeting. Father Mazzuchelli from his memoirs. Although his missionary lifestyle required him to be far removed from the community life which Dominicans typically experience, Father Samuel bore this suffering well, seizing the opportunity to plant church communities everywhere he went. Throughout my life, I have attended Mass at several of the churches he planted. I grew up attending St. Mary's in Iowa City, and I've also had occasion to attend St. Matthias in Muscatine, St. Francis de Sales in Hazel Green, and the Cathedral of St. Raphael in Dubuque. In my research trips, I traveled to some of the other sites of churches he had designed and helped build. I navigated the narrow one-ways of Schulzburg to find St. Matthew's and take pictures of the names of the streets he had christened. I visited St. Patrick's and his tiny rectory in Benton. I tramped around the Sinsinawa Mound, walking the same trails he would have walked. I skated across the frozen parking lot at New Diggings to capture St. Augustine's, one of the few remaining original structures he built. I wandered the old streets of Galena in search of St. Michael's, and still I have not begun to scratch the surface. Bellevue, Burlington, Cuba City, Davenport, Gary Owen, Green Bay, Kaukauna, Mackinac, Potosi, Prairie du Chien, and Rock Island. Did this man ever sleep? As the prairie had put down its deep roots, Father Mazzuchelli had planted the seeds of Catholicism deep in the rich Midwest soil, where they bloom to this day. Fourth pillar, ministry. Let us wake up then, open our eyes in apostolic charity, and if we are called, set out for any place where the work is great and difficult. Father Mazzuchelli from his memoirs. Father Samuel served the people of the Midwest ceaselessly for over 30 years. He administered the sacraments and tended their spiritual needs, always ready to share in their joys and sorrows. He had great respect for the Native Americans and defended their cause, writing to President Andrew Jackson in protest of the injustice of Indian removal policies. He also served the European immigrants to the area, Irish, Germans, and French. The Irish were so charmed by his spirit that they adopted him, giving him the more Celtic nickname Father Matthew Kelly. Ultimately, it was this fourth pillar, this selfless ministry, which led to his death. In February of 1864, at the age of 57, Father Mazzuchelli contracted pneumonia while ministering to the sick in the bitter Wisconsin winter. Returning home to his tiny rectory, he found the fire out and the house freezing cold. It was in these mean conditions that he began his last journey. As is true of many a saint, he had so long practiced the daily death to self that when the final death came, he met it well prepared. After suffering for several days, this tireless missionary, the good and faithful servant, entered into his long-deserved rest. How lovely are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longeth and fainteth for the courts of the Lord. With these words he died. He was buried in Benton in the cemetery behind St. Patrick's Church. In so many ways, Father Mazzuchelli embodies the Midwest, boundless and far-reaching as the open skies and rippling prairies, always moving fluidly, taking life's twists and turns, carving a path like the great Mississippi River, firm in his convictions as the bedrock and the bluffs and the mounds. He has become so thoroughly embedded in the history and religion of the region that he has become a landmark in and of himself, planting and cultivating the seeds of Catholicism and education. His life and legacy continue to inspire people to this day. It was my honor to explore even a little of his territory in search of the history of a man whose life had had such a strong yet subtle connection to my own. Yet while I thoroughly enjoyed retracing his steps, pursuing Mazzuchelli has left me with the rather uncomfortable feeling that I really ought to do something. The same sort of feeling I get when I go out into nature. I must preserve this legacy. I must build upon what is already here. What good are the saints of the past if they fail to inspire the saints of the future? There's no denying the man was unique, a powerhouse, extraordinarily talented, and, to put it bluntly, a saint. I can almost hear him laughing at me. Yes, though he was all these things, he would insist that he was merely a man who had given himself entirely to God. And, he reminds me gently, as I have done, so also you must do.